Albert Fisher parks his car outside the cemetery and introduces himself as the cemetery director to the police officers standing there. The officer alerts Detective Blake of his arrival, who is inside investigating. She directs her subordinate to keep Albert outside. Albert is still unclear about what has happened here while the paramedics drag a heavily injured young man out of the building into a wheelchair. They try to foster the young man who seems physically and mentally as he's reticent. Meanwhile, Detective Blake questions Albert about Curran Xavier, whom he hired a while ago to help Darren in the cemetery. Albert is confused to see him in such a state because he has been doing a good job until now. Everything was completely fine when Darren first drove Curran to the cemetery. He had mentioned how nice Albert was, and that he's been working with him since he started this business. Curran didn't have a good job or workplace before, but Darren assures him that where they're headed now is amazing. Curran has bruises on his face but still a hopeful smile to have a new beginning. The sun is about to set when Darren pulls up his truck outside the huge, and almost historic, building of the cemetery. Curran looks around the property with curiosity and wipes his feet on Darren's command before he enters the immaculate house. Darren is looking forward to their busy day ahead as there will be a lot of functions. Plus, the guests will be arriving shortly. Darren sits Curran down to school him on how things are run around here. Oddly enough, Curran looks very overwhelmed. Curran has never worked in a place like this before, but Darren's sure that he'll fit just right in. So he hands him a form for the job of funeral services assistant and Curran signs it, marking it as the official start of his new job. He later asks Darren about how much he will be paid for this job. Darren responds that he'll take him to Albert to discuss these matters after he's done with showing him around the building. Darren emphasizes how important it is for Curran to make sure that there are no trespassers on the property. It's because this is one of the oldest cemeteries in the country and is heritage listed as well. Darren walks him through the check-in place and the service schedule book, where all the incoming and outgoing jobs are logged. He also mentions the groundsman he'll be working with who might not talk to him since that's just his nature. The antisocial groundsman, Michael, keeps working outside. Meanwhile, Darren brings Curran to a dark room with a wooden sliding door. As they both step in, Darren admits that this place is a bit creepy. He explains that this is the place where they send people off to their afterlife, hoping that they'd never return. Curran chuckles in disbelief until Darren leads him to the crematorium where he'll be working for most of the time. He'll be taken through the safety induction tomorrow because they obviously don't want him to accidentally burn him. Darren makes a joke about how Curran should burn the bodies until they're well done, but Curran is still a little unsettled at how lightly Darren takes these things. They carry on with their tour and view a room where a funeral is being held. Curran peeks into the room filled with mourning guests dressed in black as they wait for the service to be over. They need to get to work. This is when Albert walks out of the room and greets his employee. He can see that Curran is already healing and inquires how he's been liking this place so far. Curran seems positive about the whole experience. Albert brings up how highly Felix talks of Curran, which is why he is being hired in the first place. Albert appreciates Darren as well, before he goes on about how the deceased man in the room perished due to but strangely didn't leave a note. The man's family is devastated because they don't know why he did it. Darren again jokes about how lost souls like these have trouble crossing over. Albert cuts him off and reminds him that they're literally at a chapel at this moment. Darren keeps joking nevertheless, which causes Albert to check up on Curran to see if he is already fed up with Darren's antic. This polite yet professional interaction ends as Albert returns to the service. Tom is a proper goon, dominating the homeless and destitute people taking refuge under a bridge in an abandoned alley. He harshly grabs a homeless woman's hair and pulls her up from the ground for losing his meth. The woman, Amy, pushes him away. Her well-wisher, Willie, who is also Tom's henchman, tries to warn her that resistance is only going to make things worse. He was right, as Tom grapples Amy's head more violently this time and keeps hurting her. She eventually blurts out her confession that she must have lost his money on her way to the hospital. Tom suspects that Amy is using the product she's supposed to sell for herself even though he pays her to support her filthy habit. He decides to not supply her anymore, but she begs him to not cut her off. She moves closer to him and mentions that she has a buyer lined up for tonight. The buyer might move on to the next seller if she doesn't show up. Tom grants Amy a last chance with a threat and a scumbag lick to her face before leaving. Willie slips Amy some to sell before Tom takes him away. Curran starts working properly the next day as he cleans around the house and the crematorium. He is still not getting much of a friendly chatter out of Michael when he passes him by. It is after Curran asks him questions and offers to help him that he finally manages to get a rude yet verbal response out of Michael. Amy sneakily gives away all her earnings to an old man she seems close with, instructing him to not disclose where he got the money from. She is terrified of what Tom might do to her, now that she won't have his money again. Curran returns from working the grounds with Michael to Albert's office. He and Darren have been having a little party of their own over there with some soda and snacks. Michael doesn't enter the room and is just standing outside, by the window. Albert gives him a bottle of beer anyway. He's treating his staff to drinks due to the hectic weeks they've had working here. Curran refuses to drink as he's not too fond of it. He gets to know more about Michael, who tends to never enter the building and takes his job as groundsman too literally. Albert leaves to get stronger drinks while Darren pressures Curran to drink, misusing his authority as his boss. Sometime later, Albert tries to calm down Darren, who has become a very aggressive drunk. Curran feels insulted and walks out with his bag. Albert then goes after him and tries to clarify that Darren is a foul drunkard and probably won't remember any of this tomorrow. He also attempts to clear the air between them, but to no avail. Curran doesn't act rude, but he still makes it known that it's unacceptable to be treated this way. Curran walks back home when Tom hits Amy for messing up her job again. He kicks and shoves her around as if she's a bag of trash. He knows about her secret meeting and demands to know who the man is. He throws a punch at her face when she doesn't give up the man's identity. Tom is brutally beating her when Curran passes by. He immediately jumps in to rescue Amy and attacks Tom and Willie. The two team up to retaliate and beat Curran until he spits blood. They catch sight of Amy trying to sneak out of there and chase her. 1 month ago, Curran had worked at a restaurant. He helped out in the kitchen and waited tables occasionally. Sometimes, he'd bring some food out to the alley where Pops, the old man Amy helps, used to be. Willie spied on them as Curran handed food to Pops. One night, when Curran was done washing dishes, he faced Tom and Willie trying to break into the kitchen, begging for food. Curran tried to turn them down politely, but they took advantage of his courtesy. Their way into the kitchen, Tom and Willie stole pots, pans, money, and food, while the poor boys struggled to fight them off. Tom and Willie eventually got into a scuffle with Curran and his box, which turned bloody. It was after a lot of violence that Curran was finally able to push them out of his workplace. Nevertheless, Curran found himself fired due to this incident. He confided in Felix about how disheartened he was after losing 2 jobs within just a month. Curran had pleaded with Felix to pay his rent for the next 2 months and managed to get a favor from his friend. Fast forward to now, Curran walks back into the spooky house as a new morning dawns. However, the wooden doors are locked from the inside, so he knocks instead to get entry. After getting no response, he shouts for Darren, but to no use. Michael stands back behind him ominously and startles him. Curran asks Michael about Darren's whereabouts, but all he gets are the keys to the property to carry on with his work. Michael instructs him to return the keys once he's done, and Curran finally enters the house. Curran walks in when he senses a shadow fluttering behind him on the flight of stairs. He also finds some mysterious white powder on one of the coffins and follows its trail up to the first floor. The whole corridor is a mess, and there are some black marks on the floor as well. He steps into Darren's office and finds it empty with still no trace of Darren. He proceeds to find a mop to clean up all the strange debris, when some of the lights begin to flicker and a chair moves by itself behind him. As he passes one room after another on the exterior of the property, he fails to notice the blood-soaked stones swarming with ants. He observes the footprints left behind and soot on the crematorium's floor. Curran mops the soot off and pulls down the lever to ignite the crematorium, but it doesn't light up. Curran places his hand on the cremator's surface and witnesses it to be cold, so he overviews the manual. It still doesn't turn on. Therefore, he resorts to calling Darren, who stalls him and orders him to keep trying for the next half hour instead of bothering him. Curran notifies Darren about the state his office has been in. In response, he discovers that Darren hasn't been there since yesterday, which means someone else is responsible for this. Curran suspects that this is a break and enter, but Darren dismisses him under the assumption that Alfred was looking for something. Darren feels like he has no other option left but to come over there and help Curran himself, but he sure isn't very pleased about this. Curran is still cleaning when Darren finds him. They try and guess the reasons behind all the mess, but Darren just decides to assume that Curran has caused some error with the furnace. Darren orders Curran to clean up downstairs without touching anything in his office. It is when Curran finally walks out of his office that Darren shows how anxious and clueless he is about all the mess. A spooky gust of wind blows inside the house, shutting books and windows as Darren makes his way to the crematorium. Darren tries to get the furnace running, but it completely goes out after its light flickers for a while. This is followed by a bulb bursting in the crematorium, unleashing immense darkness. Meanwhile, Curran feels something moving behind him and goes into an abandoned bathroom on a hunch. The bathroom has no lights except for some rays of sunshine breaking in past the cobwebs and dust. Since there's nothing there, Curran walks away oblivious to the fact that the door behind him shut itself aggressively. On the other hand, Darren has turned on his flashlight to look around the crematorium. His movements reflect how paranoid and scared he is. He instantly jumps when the fuse box explodes with some sparks. He is panting at this point when a chair flies across the room in front of his eyes. To his horror, he feels a fist clutching onto his hair even though there is no one else in the room besides him. The glare from his flashlight shows him multiple objects suspended in the air, while he senses the weight of an inhumane being attached to his shoulder. He tries to make a run for it, but that's just not possible for him anymore as he falls to his feet as if the ground under him was pulled away. He is dragged and thrown across the room by an unseen force until his face is bloody and he is begging for help. Things take a darker turn as the previously malfunctioning furnace turns on suddenly. Darren moves away and manages to get back up on his feet despite his injuries, while fresh ashes blow out from the crevices in the furnace. Breathing heavily, he leans in towards the cremator and hesitantly swings its door open. The flames erupt in his face and he lets out a blood-curdling scream. Curran rushes to Darren as soon as he hears his scream, ignoring the lights blinking around him. Blood begins to boil out of the sinks, adding to the horrific situation. Curran finds Darren. The fire consumes his body and he writhes around in pain. He sobs and watches in horror as Darren finally gives up and his body plops down on the floor like a heap of clothes. In the present, the paramedics detect how fast Curran's heartbeat is, even though his face is expressionless. He is recalling the painful sight of Darren's demise. The paramedics instruct Curran to take deep breaths as Albert watches him over in concern. The forensics department takes photographs of the active crime scene in the crematorium. They pick up the watch with pliers from Darren's ashes as his body has burned down to a crisp. Detective Blake later shows this watch to Albert and he identifies it as Darren's. He puts 2 and 2 together and realizes that Darren has met a terrible fate. However, he is still confused because Darren wasn't even supposed to be here this morning. He had called in sick earlier on. Detective Blake questions Albert about his whereabouts next, and he cooperates, listing down all the errands he ran today. Albert doesn't even know that Darren's office was ransacked before. He still sees no reason why anyone would want to murder a nice and likable guy like him. That evening, Felix comes over to Curran's place for dinner. Curran doesn't talk at all and stares blankly at his dinner. Curran's girlfriend, Sarah, puts the knife and fork in his hand out of courtesy. Curran's face turns up in disgust as he can see worms slithering in his spaghetti that are only visible to him. He throws the plate away and falls to the floor as his friends carry him to his room. Sarah later tries to talk to him and comfort him because of the rough day he had. She offers him solace and a listening ear. A tear rolls down Curran's cheek while he keeps looking outside the window. She angles his face towards her and takes him in her embrace. She even stays by his side as he struggles to sleep in his bed with his hands still trembling, soot under his nails. They had been in university together. Sarah cared deeply about Curran, even when he shared that he only had 2 weeks to pay for his university, or else he would be kicked out. She assured him that they would figure this out together like they always do and that his entire education wouldn't go down the drain like this. All in all, she has been with him through thick and thin. Now, she is crying in the kitchen by herself because she can see the fear and pain in Curran's eyes when she was with him. Felix views this as an opportunity to jump in and lend her a shoulder to cry on. He gives her a hug and promises to take care of Curran tonight while she'll be away at her dorm. Sarah takes this as a kind gesture and fails to see that he has feelings for her. Crickets chirp in the dark night when a stream of white smoke begins to flow from under Curran's bed. His body convulses profusely, sweat dripping down his skin, and he experiences a seizure. The veins on his body get so dark that they become visible on his skin and he gasps for air. He gets the vision of a demon jumping out at him. Eventually, he finally comes out of that horrifying trance. When he opens his eyes, it's not really him behind those orbs. There's another, a more sinister soul inside him. Curran, now demonized, takes some time to familiarize himself with his surroundings as if he is some sort of foreign animal. Then, he runs out on the streets frantically without even putting a shirt on. He is foaming at the mouth and ends up at Tom's classic hangout place. Curran spots and follows Tom like a manic predator. Meanwhile, Tom enters a dark alley and splits up all the illegitimate money he has made today with Willie. Tom is still basking in the glory of beating up a man for money. When Willie argues that he needs more, Tom shuts him down, so Willie runs off to spend whatever less money he has on drugs and whatnot. As soon as Tom is alone, a beastly Curran prowls at him from the back and knocks him down. Willie turns around and recognizes Curran as their old nemesis, but Curran won't be so nice today. He shoves Willie off with such force that he slams his face right into the alley's graffiti wall. Tom pulls a blade from his pocket to deal with this freak of nature that has appeared before him in Curran's form. But he is no match for Curran's strength. Curran grunts and growls at Willie like a wounded tiger, because Tom's blade has inflicted him with a cut to his ribs. Curran begins to retreat, so Tom chases after him to finish him off for good. Willie doesn't join him on this goose chase as he is very content with stealing all the money Tom left behind in his fit of rage. Curran dashes toward the cemetery where the mansion is acting up like a proper haunted house. Apparitions made out of dark smoke roam the halls. Lights are acting out of control, and objects are flying around as if they have a life of their own. The spirit-like entities disperse into the air, leaving behind the white ashy powder Curran found all over the mansion this morning. Meanwhile, Tom fearlessly strides into the cemetery, calling out to Curran to stop lurking and come forward. Unfortunately, he is no longer dealing with a human. Demonic creatures peek out from behind gravestones in the dark of the night, but he can't see them because of the fog that surrounds him. They attack him and he loses his macho demeanor at once. He starts looking for refuge as he rolls off from one level of ground to another within the spooky graveyard. For a second, he believes that he is out of the woods. But that isn't the case as he is dragged back into the hellhole owned by Albert Fisher. It starts to rain and droplets of water blend with Tom's blood and fall to the ground. His lifeless body is up on a tree as if he is crucified like a low-life Antichrist. When the sun of a new dawn rises in the sky, Curran lies asleep in his apartment's living room. He is shirtless and has left his muddy footprints all over the house. Sarah unlocks the door to the apartment and gets even more worried when she finds him in this state. She immediately tries to wake him and prop him up from the floor. Curran is unresponsive, so she calls Felix from his room. Together, Felix and Sarah throw Curran on the couch. Sarah then dismisses Felix as his caretaker because he has disappointed her. Felix leaves while Sarah watches over Curran, who is still unconscious. He gets the shivers and his skin is stone cold, so she draws a warm bath for him. Sarah is searching for blankets for him when Detective Blake and her colleague knock at the door. Sarah answers the door and lies that Curran isn't home. She also lies to cover for him when the police question her about his whereabouts since yesterday. They make an effort to barge in, but she doesn't let them, so they inform her of the second murder that happened at the cemetery last night. This is alarming for Sarah, but she doesn't let it show. Nevertheless, Detective Blake gives her card to Sarah in case of an emergency. Sarah is out of breath and in a state of panic when she finally shuts the door. When she checks up on Curran, he is lying still underwater in the bathtub, so she pulls him out. She pushes his chest to get the water out when he comes to his senses and screams in fear and frenzy. Sarah covers Curran up and brings him to Felix's store because she has nowhere else to go. Curran's evil senses kick in when Sarah mentions the cops to Felix. Sarah and Felix decide to take Curran to the hospital when they notice that he has fled out of the store in pursuit of a car driving down the street. Albert is driving this car and stops it when he arrives at his house. Willie startles Albert when he jumps out of the bushes and blackmails him for more money. Albert kicks him out of his property because he no longer feels threatened after Tom's demise. He pours himself a drink as soon as he makes it inside. He is in for a shock when his gaze falls upon Curran standing creepily outside his house. Albert comes out to see what he is up to, but gets ambushed by his possessed employee instead. Willie has been roaming around nearby, so he sees Curran driving Albert's car to the cemetery in the pouring rain. After reaching the cemetery, Curran pulls an injured Albert all the way to the crematorium. When Albert comes to his senses, the first thing he sees before him is the furnace. This instantly leads him to the conclusion that Curran murdered Darren. Curran punches Albert and creeps up on him like a rabid dog. Curran informs Albert of an unknown entity's arrival before slaughtering him. Turns out that Albert and Darren were drunk driving and ran over Amy when she was running away from Tom. Tom used this as an opportunity to blackmail Albert and Darren, while Willie wept at her demise. Albert and Darren disposed of Amy by cremating her instead of taking her to the hospital. They did nothing when she screamed, so her spirit took over Curran's body to get revenge. Felix and Sarah drive out of the cemetery later with Curran's ashes, knowing he perished for a good cause.